Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott. All right, you have a question for me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm nervous.
Are you? Why?
Scott never tells me the questions before he asks me, so I don't know what's coming. I have no idea.
The big question is, why do you like Tryphena so much?
Oh, that is a good question. I know why I like Tryphena so much. Okay, well, let's bring it back. I think we talked about this in the episode a little bit, but the first time I met Tryphena, we had a mutual connection, and this connection had been telling us for probably months, oh, you guys need to get together. You'd really get along. And we both had little kids at home, and we were just busy. So finally, you were away. You were traveling all the time during this era of our lives.
Like half
for
of
work.
the year.
So I was alone with our daughter a lot. Finally, I was like, you know what? Yeah, I need a friend. I'll go to Tryphena's house and we'll just see how this is. And I go there and it's all perfectly clean and decorated. And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Wait, really?
Yeah, she had the house clean. There's a veggie tray out, and she was really worried to have me over. Like, she wanted to put on a good show for me. And what I loved about her was by 5 minutes in, we're talking about like our deepest trauma. We're talking about our birth stories. Like, we just had this instant connection, which is hard to find in a friend, where you just instantly feel so safe and like you can just share anything with that person. So within a few minutes, we're just talking about all these things that it's like, you can't just talk to anybody about these things. And there's just this feeling of safeness with her. And then of course our daughters are the same age. So they were playing and they were having a really fun time. And I could see Try's defenses that were up because she wants to present herself as someone who you'd want to be friends with. But as she felt safe with me and I felt safe with her, the defenses kind of came down. And by the end, we had the kids watching Paw Patrol and there was just Cheerios all over the floor. And
it dissolved into chaos.
It dissolved into chaos, this beautiful chaos that we both live in as parents. Yeah. Like, her and I are both not the moms to make full gourmet meals. So we're just not that kind of parent.
Yeah, not the most planful.
Yeah, exactly. We both kind of thrive in the chaos that is parenting. Mm-hmm. And I think we could really relate on that. So I think, why do I like Tryphena so much? She makes me feel really safe when I talk to her. I feel like I can talk to her about anything, from religion to inner child healing to our marriage. And you and I have had great conversations with her and her husband about difficult things. And I also feel like we can have fun and just be silly together too and live in this chaos. Why do you like Tryphena so much?
Well, I feel like in general, like for the two of us and Mark and Tryphena, there's like a mutual respect for one another. And I like the fact that when you're talking to them, you feel like the defenses aren't up. The ego is not causing us to have to say things that aren't quite true just to make us look a little bit better. Like, we can be fully upfront and honest. There's a mutual feeling of safety and there's no judgment.
And just let me go there. Two other things. Vulnerability.
Yeah.
I think with a lot of our friends, and Scott and I are very privileged to have quite a few close friends. And I think the biggest factor that allows us to have these friendships is vulnerability.
Yep.
And I think there's a safeness because we are already vulnerable online to the world. So people know that we're open having these kind of deeper conversations and just being real about who we are. And I think when we're vulnerable and authentic and truly ourselves in a friendship, it makes the friends also feel like they can be open and vulnerable with us. And I think that brings a sense of safety and authenticity to the friendship. That's really pretty cool.
It seems like almost every single time we hang out with a couple friends, we dive into trauma or parenting issues that we're struggling with or whatever. It's like a real conversation. It's not surface level.
I think neither of us know how to do small talk.
Yeah, I know. I hate small talk.
Yeah.
It's the worst. That was my least favorite part of being a sales engineer, was the small talk, meeting new customers, going to trade shows, and it was so exhausting.
Small talk is probably one of the most exhausting things. And I think that's why we really like Tryphena and Mark and so many of our other good friends, because we don't have to do the whole small talk thing. We can just get right into it. How was your week? Oh, it was terrible. Oh, okay. Tell me more. Why was it terrible? And we can just get right into it. And I think there is something so powerful. And I know it's really hard to find friendships as adults. I think in the last maybe 5-6 years, we've really established some beautiful friendships. But I think we've had seasons. And I remember when I first became a mom, and I was actually running Our Mama Village at the time, which Nurtured First, the name was Our Mama Village before. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't met Chrissy yet, who Chrissy is my good mom friend as well. And none of my other friends had kids. And I remember running our Mama Village and being like, man, I'm running this page for mom and I feel so connected to moms online, but I don't really have any moms in my own life. And I don't really have any mom friends that I can relate to in my own life. So a way of me starting the page at the time, our Mama Village, was to actually just have some connections with other moms who could say that they got it and understood what I was going through. And I remember feeling pretty lonely in that season. Like, none of my friends have kids yet. No one really gets what I'm going through.
Yeah, definitely. And then I was gone a lot.
Yeah, you traveled a lot. And I think my outlet of having that online page where I connected with moms actually saved me in a way, because I was getting stories from moms being like, no, I'm going through this too, Jess. Like, you're not alone. And that really helped. And then over time, I met another one of our friends who is a really good friend. And we actually met because Scott's cousin bought a couch off of them on Kijiji, which is like an online sales. Buy and sell. And then Scott's cousin connected us. And then she's also one of our good friends. So you can find friends in all sorts of random places. Another one of our friends we met because her child didn't have a diaper and she had a newborn, and she asked me if we had a diaper and wipes at our child's school, and we just ended up becoming friends. So I think my encouragement to anyone who feels like they don't have parent friends is there's lots of random places we can make friends, and any friendship that we've actually made has come because of intention, right?
Yeah, definitely.
For example, that couch scenario, Scott's cousin reaches out to me, hey, I just bought a couch off this Kijiji from this girl who is also a therapist and has a kid the same age as you and lives in the same town. You should reach out. And intentionally taking that step to reach out is how I made that friend, which I think sometimes we feel like friendships just kind of have to fall in our lap, or we have to have been friends with them forever. But I know a lot of the friends that I have, or we have, it's you intentionally going out for a beer with your buddy.
Yeah.
And making that time. And you're really good at that, actually.
Yeah, I try to.
To go back to Tryphena,
yep.
What we do that works
we went off on a little tangent.
Yeah, we went off on a little tangent about friendship. But I do think it's a topic that we can all relate to, because we need togetherness. We need community. And even if that looks like seeing a friend once a month, that outlet to talk to someone who gets it and who's going through something similar is really powerful. Mm-hmm. For Try and I know what we do is audio message. And so she'll send me like 3 audio messages. Jess, I just thought about this. What about, religion and this and this and this? And there'll always be like the deepest thoughts that she's ever had. And then I'll listen, and 4 days later, when I finally have a minute, I will audio message her back. And so it doesn't look perfect. It's not like we're constantly texting every single day, but those messages, those little touch points, I think
even every 4 days is pretty good.
Every 4 days. Yeah, every 4 days is pretty good. Yeah, and that's increased, I think, in the last few years where we've really deepened our friendship. But friendship in this season can look totally different. And I'm really excited for everyone to hear from Tryphena today. She has a lot of really important things to say. And I think we can both agree this conversation has really stuck with us ever since we had this podcast with her.
Yeah, definitely. You got into a lot with her on this podcast. I think it's quite interesting. And you can tell she thinks about everything very deeply, which is what we love about her also.
Oh, another thing we love about Try.
Yep.
All right, so without further introduction, let's get into it. So how has the back to school transition been? Because I'm actually so curious. I feel like every time I talk, you're just like, it's been a hot mess. But yeah, how's it been going?
Every time you talk to me, it's a hot mess over here.
Well, that's what you're saying. I don't know if it's actually a hot mess, but
I think it's a hot mess. Okay, so I have 2 kids. They're both in different schools this year. My oldest had like a really bad autistic burnout last year and didn't go to school for 2.5 months. So he's going to school this year, which is a win. We're like, oh, we're going into a building and leaving our bed. These are huge wins. But it just means that anytime, like, it takes all of his minimal capacity. So mornings and evenings are complete shit shows. And yeah, there's just a lot of screens and a lot of downtime. Like, really, it's about school for him.
Right.
For my youngest, our daughter, oh my gosh. So she's at her own school, which is kind of fun. We get to bike together in the morning, and she's going. 4 days in, her teacher had a family emergency and is no longer there. So
Oh.
they have yet to find a teacher, which I completely understand this happens, but this is just the chaos of transition. Her emotions are through the roof.
She's like such a strong, fierce child. And I just absolutely love that about her. I'm wondering, like, when you see Kaya as a kid, like, were you like that when you were a kid? Like, were you like more like a Kaya or were you more quiet? Like, what were you like?
Oh, it's such a good question. Okay. So it's funny. I don't think I was like Kaya, but I think I wanted to be like Kaya. I think it's still true in my life. I look at Kaya and I'm like, I want to be you when I grow up. Like, she's so good at advocating for herself, at like voicing her opinions. Even the other day, I was like, Kaya, can we clean your room together? Because I was feeling stressed by it. And she looks at me and she's like, you are trying to make me do what is safe for your body and not what is safe for my body. No, thank you. I was like, are you
Oh,
kidding me? Like, can you chill for 5 seconds? But no. Okay, so I grew up in a different space where I like it was like a loving home, but obviously like an Indian household. And the value wasn't on like agency and autonomy. The value was on listening to the people in authority over you. And so I think I was really good at playing like the good girl role and then just being like really resentful versus Kaya is really good at advocating for herself, which I'm still like very much learning in my life, which is wild.
yeah, I feel like that's really interesting. Like, so often, and I find this with our oldest too, right? Like, she is so much like me, but maybe more like the me that I would have been if I wasn't so worried about being that good girl and all of that kind of stuff. Like, she's a lot more vocal and assertive and
Yeah, definitely.
confident. Yeah, all those things.
We've talked about that at length, where she's all the things that we wish we were like when we were
Mhm.
kids.
Yeah.
And it's amazing because you've instilled all of that in her, right? You've given her that space for her voice and her agency, and she's
Yeah.
able to do that.
Is there anything else that you see when you see, okay, well, she's who maybe I could have been if my parents were able to validate my feelings or understand, or what else are you feeling when you're seeing that with her?
So it's really, this is the hard part. You know, how, like the whole dichotomy of you can feel more than one emotion at the same time. I can feel pride and I can also feel like it's triggering. We've talked a lot about this, about how parenting is being a big journey of having to reparent ourselves. And I think there's a part where I feel sad for little Try for not being able to, you know, vocalize some of the things that Kaya is able to. I also, there's times when, so especially because of what our last year has looked like with burnout and all of that, sometimes Kaya's emotions are her yelling, and there has to be space for her to express what she's feeling in a kind way. That's a whole other conversation. But I get really triggered by it sometimes because sometimes her emotions are, you're the worst, you're stupid, you don't care about me, da 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 da. And from her little 6-year-old perspective, like she's seen her brother get more attention this year. So to her, it feels like no one cares about her. So oh my gosh, I'm all over the place. I apologize. So we are a mixed household. I am an Indian woman. My husband is French Canadian. My daughter is mixed, but in the winter can very much pass as a little white girl. So when she's yelling at me, like little brown Try is like losing her shit because little white girl's yelling at her. And so I think it's really like there's a triggering part to me when I see her step into her power and like her authority where I feel sad and then I feel attacked and then I feel like I'm not good enough. Really, it's this whole mess. This is what therapy is for. This is like,
Yeah. There's something that's so what I love about you and why we're such good friends is you're so reflective. I feel like you take those pieces and you think, okay, well, Kaya's yelling at me. Like, what is that saying about me? Like, why am I getting so triggered? And I think the fact that you can see that is little Try who feels like when you were little, when you were Kaya's age, like, were you getting yelled at by, like, is it your parents? Is that what you're feeling? Is it other kids at school?
for sure, my parents, and not like, I think it's just how they were taught to communicate themselves, but also like feeling like one of the only kids of color in my spaces and then feeling left out. I think when she yells at me, it makes me feel like an outsider in my own family, which is, it's my own stuff that I have to work on. But I think it's my journey of like my own insecurities and validations that it really triggers.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to feel like the outsider in your own family.
This is not where I thought the conversation would go. Oh my God.
This is why I love
It
talking to
never
you.
is with Jess.
Yeah.
No, it isn't. I love it.
Yeah, no, I just feel like everything you say, I'm always so interested. And to feel like the outsider in your family, and because of the way Kaya's yelling, like I can see that. And I feel like this last year, I mean, you guys have been through so much with Gray's diagnosis and the burnout in school and all of those things that sometimes even having her yell, or it's just like one more thing, can also be super overstimulating and just isolating to you. And I know you and Mark have been through so much this year with all of that. How do you balance like letting her have that autonomy and that space to have the voice that you didn't have and that you wish that you had, and also being like, okay, but you can't just yell, I hate you to me all the time, because you don't actually love me.
She's so interesting because she's a different, like, I parent her very different than I parent Gray, intentionally and unintentionally, because she needs to like say what she's going to say, and she goes to her room. You can't talk to her, and she'll come out 10 minutes later and she's like, I'm really sorry. Like, she has her own introspection and she comes back and apologizes, but you cannot rush it. I feel like I've told you this even from the time she was 2. It's like, hey, Kaya, we need to talk about your behavior. Okay, before bed. And literally she'll drag it out till 10:30 at night and be like, okay, now I'm ready to talk.
Yeah.
And she knows when she's ready to talk, or if she's too in her own emotions, or she's too overstimulated. So I'm learning with her, I really need to give her that space. And it takes a lot of control on my part, because I realize I'm a very verbal processor just in my own life. And so to be like, okay, I actually can't process this with you right now. I need to wait till you're ready. And when she is ready, it's the best conversation.
Right.
It's just, you cannot do it in the moment with her.
Yeah. And I agree. I feel like she's been like that from the start. For you, I kind of wanted to go back to, you were talking about growing up in an Indian family and your parents. Now, are your parents immigrants?
My parents both immigrated to Canada.
Okay. How old were they when they immigrated?
Like both like early 30s. My dad came here first for school and then went back and got married. And my mom came here right after they were married. Like, I don't know how she did it, where she marries someone new and moves to a new country. It's wild.
Did they know each other? Like, did they date before they were married?
It was an arranged marriage. Like, they knew of each other. They had run in similar communities. But yeah, it was an arranged marriage.
And how long after they got married did they have? You're the oldest, right?
I am the oldest. I think it was, oh my gosh, I think it was like 4 years. So my mom had 5 miscarriages before me.
Oh, wow.
And it's like and one ectopic. And at that point, you actually remove a tube, right? So it was just,
Yeah.
it was a whole, like, they had a whole journey of infertility before.
Wow. So for your parents, like arranged marriage, new country, 5 miscarriages, and then they had you. Like, that's quite the journey even before having a new baby.
Absolutely. And like, just like the trauma they had to endure and all of that, and just the hardship, and significant.
All right, it's that time of the show where we hear from our sponsor. Oh wait, that's us, Nurtured First. Attention, all sleep-deprived parents. Do you feel like a zombie during the day because your little one keeps you up at night? Well, I've got some news for you. You're not alone. I've been there too, struggling to keep my eyes open and my sanity intact. But here's the thing, I refuse to let my kids cry it out alone. Call me a softie, but I believe in being a cycle-breaking dad. That's why I'm excited to tell you about Jess's helpful approach to sleep. Imagine this, a world where bedtime is less of a battle, and you wake up feeling a bit more refreshed and ready to tackle the day. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, it's possible. In the Solving Bedtime Battles course, Jess shares the tools and strategies that have helped thousands of parents improve their child bedtime routine. We've got practical tips and tricks that aim to not only help your child develop better sleep habits, but also strengthen your bond with them. Whether you've got a toddler, preschooler, or big kid, this course has got you covered. From tackling night wakings to dealing with procrastination and even navigating sibling room sharing, we've thought of it all. So, if you're ready to work towards improving your child's bedtime routine and your family's sleep, check out the Solving Bedtime Battles course now. And here's the best part, you can get it for 10% off today using the code ROBOTUNICORN. Check out the show notes and start your journey to better sleep habits today. Your future self just might thank you.
So growing up in an Indian family, I mean, I know your parents make delicious food because we've had it and it's amazing. But tell me, what's the culture like? You've talked a lot to me personally about how it was very strict and a certain kind of image of like being the good girl that was really important and valuable. But what other kind of cultural pieces did they bring in from India?
Yeah. Okay. So it's funny that you're like, you've eaten their food, because that is very much how they show love to this day. Anytime they show up with food. And like, that is how you know an Indian parent loves you. It's like, I'm not going to apologize. I'm going to show up in your room with a plate of like cut fruit. Like that's my thing. Okay. So it was an Indian Christian household. And I think there's no like one monolithic cultural way of how it's going to play out. But I think in our home, like for sure, it was strict. It was like, the navigation of like they're navigating a new culture and how they raise kids in a culture that's not like what they have experienced, what the norm has been to them. And I think too, okay, so here's like, I don't know, as much as I am an Indian woman, I am not an expert on Indian culture, right?
Yeah.
But if I think of like whether it was explicitly said or inadvertently, it was just like a subconscious thing. There was an idea that your parents are like mini deities, mini gods in your life, right? And you don't question the mini god in your life. And I don't know if part of that is just like aspects of like Indian culture and reincarnation and like, you know, Hinduism, where like your parents are genuinely perceived as mini deities. So it's like God, your parents, and then you. But then that played into just even our faith experience, like a Christian Indian home, where it was like, if my parents said something, then it must be coming from God. Like my parents are never wrong. Even when they're wrong, they're right. So I think what it was like for me, it was just a space where I didn't know that I could make my own decisions or how to make my own decisions. But I would constantly be bumping up against their decisions because they never aligned with my own values. And instead of having a paradigm of like, oh, it's okay to have different perspectives, it was very like your preferences were moralized. So, oh, like you don't want to do this and we want you to do this, so therefore you are a bad person. Versus, oh, like Tryphena just has a different way of doing things. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So it's their way, like their rules, what they say.
Absolutely.
That's almost like, yeah, that's the God. That's a message from God, or that's just the authority figure that you want to listen to. And then if you have a different opinion, whether it's like small or big, it's inherently wrong because it's not coming from the parent.
That's exactly it. And it's complicated, right? It's complicated when your choices then become like moralized, or like you throw a faith perspective on there and it's like, well, you are going against like the God of the universe. It's like, oh my goodness. It hits differently as a child.
Yeah, I know this is something that we've talked a lot about because I know faith still is, but has always been a big part of your life, just growing up in a Christian Indian home as well. And now I know we've talked a lot about this, like deconstructing and looking at it differently as you grow up. So as a child, how did you view like faith, God, the world? Like what was that view like then kind of compared to your journey as you've gotten older? I know this is like, let me just ask you like the biggest questions. And
It's like, oh my goodness. What do I say? Wow. Okay. So I think as a child, I believed what I was told, like right off the bat, right? Like we were part of a really hyper conservative space to the point where it's like, you don't wear makeup, you don't play with Barbies, like all that stuff. And I remember like seeing kids on the schoolyard playing with Barbies and going up to them being like, you can't do that. Don't you know that makes you bad? And just like, I really vehemently, like, I took in what was taught to me, because whether we call it indoctrination or not, it was like, it's when you're 1 and 2 and 3, like what you hear. Like I didn't have gift of critical thinking at that point.
I see that in our kids too, right? Like basically anything you teach a child, if it's coming from their parent who they respect, they're going to believe it. So I can see that for you. And I know like in our own experiences too, like if you're growing up in that kind of culture, you're just believing everything that your parents say and you're taking that as words. So then when a child is playing with Barbies, you're like, no, like my parent says that that's bad. Like that's a bad thing to do. And then you start to feel worried about other people when you see that happening. Like I can picture that for little Try and for us too.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? And then I think as I got older, there were a lot more questions. I also I went to school for sociology, and it was like the first time that I was like, oh, there are other systems and structures at play, and I'm not just losing my mind. Like some of these things, like 1 + 1, even though I've been taught equals 2, doesn't line up to me. Or even just this idea of like, so even within, I think, the Christian faith and so many different faith traditions, there are lots of different perspectives on things. And I think even just to have the realization that it is okay to have different opinions became a really big deal to me. I was like, oh, you can have your own values. I don't know.
Do you think the first time that you recognized that? I know for me, when I first went to university, that was kind of the first time. And I think I was in a bunch of classes that I was like, oh, dang, like maybe I don't always have to think the same things that I grew up believing, or maybe I can do some things different. And that doesn't mean that I think everything about my childhood is wrong or bad, but it was the first time that I started reflecting and thinking of things a little bit differently. And I know that at the time, and I know my parents will probably listen to this podcast too, but at the time it did cause some conflict between my parents and I, right? Because there'd be things that I was like, no, like I actually think it's okay to, let's say, go shopping on a Sunday or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that was a different view. And then that was something that we had to work through and kind of talk about. Do you think going to university, was that like the first time, or did that happen earlier that you were really like, oh, maybe there are things that I want to do different and maybe there's a piece of that that's okay?
Yeah. Like honestly, I think for me, it was like middle school where I started to realize that my values were very different than my family's, whether it's like shopping on a Sunday and actually being like, I don't think that is as bad as I'm being told that it is, right? But I think up until university, I thought I was a bad person for thinking the thoughts I had, for disagreeing with people. It was like, oh, well, you must be inherently evil somehow. You've like totally lost your way, whatever that means. And I think going to university was really helpful for me and just freeing to be like, oh, there are lots of different opinions and values, and they're all held in a high regard.
Right. Like to kind of go back to what you're talking about, because I think a lot of parents that I talk to on Nurtured First feel this way too. And I think they struggle with their own kids, right? Because I think that they grew up with this feeling of, well, if I do this, then I'm a bad person inherently. And I think what you said there, I just didn't want to skip over that because I think that that's such a big feeling that a lot of us still as parents struggle with, right? If I do this, am I bad? And then on the flip side, if my child talks back to me, like when I was, the parents think, like when I was a kid, if I talked back to my parent like that, like I would have been yelled at, I would have been sent to my room. So then their automatic thought is when their child does that, like, do I have a bad kid? How did you, or are you still, I guess, kind of working through those thoughts? Because I know that that's not something that you just quickly kind of work through if that's the worldview that you were raised with.
So that is definitely something I'm still like, it's still very much like a growth process in my own life. And I don't know, like whether you're part of a faith community that has like an idea of people being inherently bad, or I think it's also just, we live in a very polarized world where we have like moralized preferences where it's like, oh, you parent this way, you're a bad parent. You parent this way, you're a good parent, right? Like, and so I struggle with this. I think it took me a long time to embrace myself, that I wasn't inherently bad and evil. And then even with my children, I think that was part of having kids, where it was like, oh my goodness, I have this incredibly delightful, beautiful little human, and they are good. Like if like I believe in a higher power. And so to me, I'm like, oh, they're made in the image of God. They're beautiful. They're full of joy. They're full of love. They're full of delight, versus this idea that at least I had been taught where it's like, oh, you know, your kids are horrible and they're evil because look at how quickly they can lie, and lying is bad, right? Like look at how quickly you ask them if like they stole the cookie and they're going to say no. And instead it's been this really big reframe of like, no, if my kids are being dishonest, or if they're quote unquote talking back, or they're yelling about their emotions, that's actually like developmentally, that is where they should be. They should be learning personal autonomy. They should be learning they can push boundaries. And if they don't have the chance to do that, then they're going to grow up like, and there's going to be serious like stunting in their attachment and their own like bodily securities. And so I'm like, it's been such a good reframe. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I have two things about that. One, I was just going to call on Scott's perspective here. So he also grew up in a home where, yeah, if you talk back to your parents, you're bad. Like, you know, the parents are kind of like the highest authority, and he'd get in trouble a lot as a kid. And I remember like we always talk about this one conversation that we had when our oldest was a toddler and she started having tantrums and stuff like that. And Scott was kind of saying, well, how do we respond? Like, can we just let her have these tantrums? Like, you know, like you kind of have this perspective when you grow up like that now my kid is bad. And anyway, we had this whole discussion. I remember exactly where we were. Hey, Scott, like driving in the car.
Actually close to where I grew up as well. I think we were just passing where I grew up. And then we had this conversation.
The timing of it all, like, obviously wasn't planned. And it was really cool because we just happened to be on a drive, just happened to be driving past where he grew up. And were having this discussion. And I was explaining to him at the time, like now he's an expert in all this, but he didn't know about developmentally appropriate expectations and the fact that kids are really supposed to have tantrums. It's a part of how they develop and grow and learn about the world and stuff like that. And I just remember, I feel like in that drive, your perspective on kids and yourself and everything just totally changed. And you can correct me if I'm wrong there,
Yeah,
Scott.
definitely. I mean, I think it's been drilled into, especially our community. I'm sure, Tryphena, you can probably relate to that, but it's kind of drilled into you that you have to obey your parents or your grandparents or anyone who's older than you, essentially. And I think that's where that idea came from, that our oldest daughter, she's having tantrums or she's talking back or whatever it was. And I had, at the time, I would say, very little understanding of the development of children and what makes sense for them to be able to do to experience their world, their life, like actually grow and develop much better habits than, let's say, we would have, or much better ways of attaching or dealing with others. Because I mean, I would still say it for myself, I still have to work on that. And you see already that our two oldest daughters are, I would say they're often better than me at doing that.
They're amazing. They are amazing at regulating.
Yeah.
Like, it honestly blows us away.
We don't put pressure on them to do that. They just, I feel like it's just day in, day out. The way we have been raising them, I think, is very different from how we were raised. And it's allowed for them to actually experience those things, name those emotions, understand other people's perspectives. And then that's allowed them to develop those skills much, much faster than we
you.
would have.
Yeah.
Me, but I would say both of us.
Both of us, totally. And we were both just very different temperament kids. But I think
Yeah.
for you, and it's like what Tri was saying, the idea of changing the perspective to like, this child is bad and this child is inherently like evil and bad, to this child is inherently good. And then that's the second point Tri was going to bring up. I said I had two. The second one is something I learned from you and Mark very soon after we started being friends. And I think it was you. And I think I heard you saying this to Kaya, like, I know you're good, Kaya. You are a good kid and you're just struggling right now. You don't want to hit Gray. And I remember you using that language with her. And it always stuck with me. And I always use that with the girls because I loved how you would always name first, like, you're good. And you don't want to hurt your brother, but you are. It's hard to control your body. And I love that language. And I think for me, and I know for a lot of people who follow Nurtured First, like starting with that language has made a huge difference. So anyway, I learned that from you guys. And I feel like you guys are so good at that.
Thanks, Jess. We try. It's this interesting thing of identity, right? You know how like they talk about your inner voice and your inner critic is often actually your parents' voice in your head. And I mean, I don't know what the science is around that, but I just realized for my kids, I'm like, they're not meaning, like, you're right. It's hard to control your body. They're not showing up being aggressive intentionally. And it's my job, it's my delight as their parent to mirror back to them who they actually are. And I get to show them that they are good and they are loving and they're creative and just remind them that that's actually how I see them. I don't just see them as someone who has lost control of their emotions or whatever it is. And so, yeah, I don't know. We try.
I love that. And then I love the idea too of, when they're older and they lose their cool or something happens, it's like, it doesn't mean that they're this inherently bad or evil person. They're like, they can use those words themselves, right? Like, I'm a good person, but I had a hard day today and now I'm going to repair that. So that's what we try and do with the girls too. Like, we want them to have that language and we want them to have that inner voice.
So good at that already.
Yeah. And they're good at it.
Yeah.
It's cute.
That's amazing.
Like this past summer, our oldest daughter was in like a triathlon. And
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, we were camping and they had like a triathlon there and she was biking and she was way behind everyone. She's like, that's okay. It's how I learn. It's like sometimes you have to make mistakes or sometimes you have to lose.
Oh,
I lost it when she said that.
I love her so much.
Yeah, I think that's her temperament too. She has like a very calm demeanor as well. And she'll always like come out with these wise things. We're like, wow, we have a lot to learn from you too.
She's so wise.
You can hear her repeating back to us what we've been saying to her.
Yeah.
It's like those are the things that we've taught her. Like, let's say I'm teaching her how to play Mario Kart. I mean, she's much better now, but she was terrible when she started. And she was like, that's okay. She like keeps falling off, falls off the circuit 100 times. She's like, that's okay. That's how I learn. I'll get better.
Oh, I love that so much. It's beautiful to hear her even articulate it back in her own language because you know she's actually internalized it when she can bring it up on her own in her own like moments.
Yeah, she's not just like reiterating a script. It's her own variation of it.
Oh,
yeah, I know. I do love that.
Definitely. And I hope that she continues to have that as her internal voice going forward. Because I feel like that's so much more powerful than, let's say, my internal voice is, you made a mistake, you screwed up. It's maybe a little bit different in my head, but basically, you need to fix this. Otherwise, you're not very smart.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
It's wild how we make a mistake and it calls our entire identity into question, right? It's like you're not very smart versus Scott, you're one of
Yeah.
like the smartest people I know. But it's like yet that entire identity gets called into question. Sorry, Jess, not taking away from your brilliance as well.
No, I'm with you. Scott's one of the
Hey, I'll
smartest
take
people
that.
I know too. So
Oh, I didn't realize the podcast was going to be all about pumping Scott's tires here.
Talk about how great Scott is, his
yeah.
amazing 3D printing. No, but so like I remember years ago I was working with a therapist. So I was a teacher by profession at that point, and I was late to a job. And I remember driving there and like my heart racing and like my palms sweating. And it wasn't like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be late. It's like, oh my goodness, Tryphena, you are the worst person ever. How could you be so stupid? You're so lazy. You have no time management. Everybody's going to hate you. And like my internal dialogue was a mess. I'm debriefing this with my counselor, and she's like, that's not typical for your internal dialogue to go to, I'm a horrible person. It
Yeah.
should be, hey, I made a mistake and it's okay. People are still going to see that I'm human. And just understanding that, like, that line, mistakes are proof that I'm trying, like that has been such a groundbreaking line for me, just to be like, oh, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to mess it up. It's actually just a picture of growth versus I am a horrible person and I have failed at life.
Yeah, I feel like that's so much of those messages that you grow up hearing. And I know Scott struggles with that too. My parents were very compassionate people. And so I feel like when I see Scott and I in relationship, or when I hear your stories, like I feel like I have more of that programming
Yeah,
of
you definitely do.
self-compassion. And I'm able to give it to myself. Like I'm still critical of myself. Obviously, I think a lot of that is also I like things to be done well and at a high standard. And that was my parents too. But I am more prone to self-compassion, where I see that in you, or I see that in Scott, where it's like, oh, if I make a mistake, then that must mean I'm terrible. Or if I don't do this right, or if someone's mad at me, that must mean that I'm a bad person. And so for you, like I know therapy's been a part of your process, but how do you handle that now? Like if you have that internal critic kind of coming up when you're seeing the kids or you're dealing with something work-wise, like do you have a specific mantra or like something that you tell yourself that helps?
So I was literally like having to write, like journal it out before I got on this like Zoom call, because I'm like, I am a smart person. I can put together sentences. Like me being myself is enough, which I know it sounds, trite and silly, but part of it is I actually just need to think, as I'm going to speak over my children, that they are good. I need to remind myself that. And so like, yeah, I will often remind myself that I am enough and I am good and I am loved. And I found, especially in moments with parenting, when parenting is really hard, I have a hard time just in the whole way of like, oh, I'm late, I must be a bad person, which, let's be honest, I am late 100% of the time. So I don't know why that's a thing.
That's when we got to let go. Yeah.
But when my kid is in a hard place, especially like around the burnout or the anger or the physicality of that, it is really hard for me to not go to, I am a bad parent and I am a bad person
Right.
in my children's dysregulated moments. And so I've had to realize, especially when my kids are dysregulated, the first person I need to take care of is little tries. You'll often see me with my child who's dysregulated, and it's like I have one hand on them and one hand on my heart. I'm like, all right, little try, you're okay. You're safe. You're not a bad person. And I'm like, I'm sure I look batshit, like just wild. But it is realizing that I get deeply triggered when they're dysregulated, and I have to first take care of myself.
Yeah. I love that visual of like hand on your heart. That's what I would always say to my clients too, like hand on your heart. And I would always tell clients, and maybe you've learned this one too, is like remind little version of yourself, like, okay, I'm in my kitchen, I'm in my own house, like I'm grown, I'm like whatever, I'm this years old. And just like bringing yourself back to the present, because your body does take you back to being that little kid who's being yelled at or who's being told they're not enough, or at least getting those messages. So I love that you do that too. It's like that grounding, like I'm in my 30s, I'm in my kitchen, I'm safe, like this is my house. And then that can help you cope with your child's emotions because the little you isn't as triggered.
Oh, it's so good. I love like that grounding. Yeah.
I feel like you've talked a lot about kind of the burnout. I don't know if you're open to sharing that journey a little bit, because I know this last year especially has been really triggering and hard, especially with Gray's diagnosis. And yeah, I'm wondering if you're willing to kind of talk a little bit about what that burnout, when you talk about burnout this year, what does that look like?
Yeah. Okay, so our oldest has like an ASD, ADHD diagnosis with like a PDA profile, which is a lot of words. So he's like pretty much autistic, has ADHD, and PDA is like pathological demand avoidance, which is like really high anxiety where any demand is just really hard. So it's like, hey, we need to brush our teeth. Seems like one demand, but actually it's like, I need to take the covers off. I need to put my feet on the ground. I need to turn on the tap. I need to, like, all of those steps are demands that feel like the biggest thing in the world. So he is like the most incredible little human. But school has been really hard the last 5 years. And so he is like high masking. So most people at school would not know that he is autistic because he quote unquote like holds his shit together and comes home and absolutely loses it. And he hit a point last year where he couldn't do that anymore. And actually, like, that's really beautiful. He needed to be a more congruent and whole person for him, but his teacher left at the end of the year unexpectedly to him, and he just couldn't. That was too much transition. And so he was in bed and he couldn't get out or get up. And it had already been building that last year. Like I messaged you at nauseum as we were trying to work through just getting the diagnosis for his own benefit, but it manifested in a lot of violence. And he is like the sweetest little boy, but he would get so dysregulated that he would just beat up on me. And he's like almost bigger than me now, right? He's stronger than me. There's not a lot I can do. And then he would come out of this moment of dysregulation. He'd be like, "Oh my gosh, mama, I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" And it was his way of communicating how done he was. So we had seen the signs leading up to the burnout. Anyway, so then we hit end of April and he no longer was able to go to school or do any of the things. And it took a while for him to rebuild his capacity. And it's still hard. Like last weekend, we went out on Saturday and Sunday, he's like, "I can't do anything. I can't go to church." I'm like, "Okay, well, let's go to," there's a new South Indian restaurant in Guelph. I'm like, "Let's go there." He's like, "I can't move." And so it's also him learning to articulate what his body can and cannot handle.
Yeah, I think it's so good to share like those real moments because I mean, those are the messages that I hear from parents all the time, like even you messaging me while it was happening, right? And I think those are the things that people don't really talk about. And they like to hear like the end story of like, yeah, now he has the words and he can talk about it and he's in a school that's better and blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really good to hear like the messy part, like the part that's like, this is what it's like to be in the process of having a child who's getting diagnosed with autism and PDA and ADHD. And that for you guys happened a bit later even than like, how old was he when he was diagnosed?
He was 7 when he was diagnosed.
Yeah.
And part of it was like, it was COVID, right? We were seeing lots happening. We had an OT in place, but the school wouldn't necessarily see it when you're doing online learning or whatever it looks like, right?
Yeah. And I hear that. I'm hearing that more and more of kids who kind of got missed in that COVID time when they weren't in school and they were home and the parents are like, okay, there's a lot of behaviors going on. There's a lot of stuff. But is that just my child can't really do the online learning thing? So for you, I mean, we've talked about like those messages that you're hearing as a child of like, you have to be good. You have to listen to authority. And then we're talking about little Try being triggered when they're yelling at you. And then we're going into this idea of like now your son who Gray, like we love Gray. He is so sweet. He is like, I just remember meeting him when he was super little. And yeah, he's
I
just,
remember that too.
he's so sweet. And so you're going into this is your child and they're beating up on you and you have all this internal dialogue like going on in your own head. Like, how are you kind of coping or not coping, I guess, in those moments?
I think there's moments when I definitely wasn't coping and I'm on the floor crying and like being like hit with the shoe or whatever it is. And there's other moments where I myself am more regulated and able to like speak truth over myself. I think it's been really helpful. Like just kind of how we were talking about even with Scott, you had that like aha moment of like, okay, now I understand child development in the same way, understanding like neurodivergence and like all behavior is communication and my kid is not vindictive. My kid is trying to communicate what he is not able to say out loud. And then also we had to really shift our parenting, which has been this really, so when we go back and we talk about this idea of being inherently bad and as a child feeling like I didn't have space for critical thinking, I realized there was a control element in that, right? It's like, well, we're going to control our children so they grow up and they do well in life. And as much as I told everyone and thought I was practicing a parenting style that gave kids autonomy and gave them agency, there was still a lot of control in it. It was like, okay, I still think inherently that you can't make the best decisions for yourself. And I know that he's 8 now. But I had to learn to trust that he actually knew what he needed. So the days that he was saying he couldn't get out of bed, it was like everyone was like, well, you got to pick him up and you got to drag him to school. That did not help. I really had to switch the thinking to be like, no, my kid actually, like his body knows. And if I'm saying that I need to learn as an adult to trust my body, I need to learn to trust that my kid knows what his body needs. And it's been wild because it's been what, 3-4 months of just him having zero capacity. But then there are days as he began to heal over the summer where he'd be like, hey, mama, can we go do this? Hey, mama, do you know that I love you? Hey, mama, can you clip my nails? Like little things that I'm like, oh, when you have space to make these decisions on your own, you actually can. But
Yeah.
you knew that you needed to not. So I think for me, to answer your question, it was so many things because it's still hard. Like, let's be honest, even though we have better systems in place, every day is still really hard. It is still very triggering. I need to do a lot of work constantly with little try and adult try to remind myself that I am okay. And it's been a huge parenting shift in our home of actually just trusting Gray. And it's been wild to see. And I mean, it's a little ridiculous. This morning for breakfast, he had told us in June, he's like, Snickers bars make me feel safe. Snickers bars are not the most nutritious things in the world. Was he anxious this morning? Yes. Did he need a Snickers bar for breakfast? He carried one with him to school. But you know what? He walked out the door dressed and confident, and I was like, okay, I don't know, but this is what your body needs right now.
You know what? Like so much of what you're saying when I was working with autistic kids, like that is exactly what we'd be coaching parents through too. Like I remember a parent and the child cold pizza in the morning made him feel safe. And he verbalized the same thing to his parent. And the parent came to me and was like, but like, I'm a bad parent if I feed my kid cold pizza for breakfast. Like that's not a nutritional breakfast. And then with the parent, I remember we really had to unpack that. Well, first off, like, why are you bad for feeding him cold pizza? Like, let's unpack that message. And then once we kind of unpack that, and it's like, okay, messages about food as a child, like there's just so much deeper things going on, right? So messages about food as a child is that pizza's not breakfast. And if I want pizza for breakfast, I get yelled at because that's dinner. So, okay, let's unpack that. And then once we unpack that, it's like, okay. And so if once in a while, when your child's having a hard morning, they need to have cold pizza for breakfast, does that make you a bad parent? And so we kind of got to a place it's like, no, if my child needs cold pizza, that's a comfort food and that's going to help them get to school and set the morning off on a really positive note because they have control over that. Like, that's okay. And that's not you being permissive or a bad parent. Like, that's actually a Snickers bar for breakfast may be the best parenting choice you can make in that morning. And so I love that example because I remember like doing that work with so many parents and being like, that's okay. And I love that Greg can like, I mean, Snickers bar comfort for me too. Like, I love that you can speak that.
I'm all for the Snickers bars. It's so true, right? And it's like, what are these arbitrary rules that make us good or bad parents? It's like your kid had pizza, your kid had food in their body.
Do you think part of that is like other parents will see Gray with a Snickers bar and then you're concerned of what they're going to think of you for sending him with a Snickers bar or any of that?
100%.
That's what I would feel is like,
You'd be worried
Yeah.
about what other people think. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I am terrified of how the world perceives our parenting because people think it's very permissive or whatever. And like even, okay, so right now, safe foods for Gray, other than his Snickers bar, is like a bag of Cheetos and a bag of Lay's for lunch. He'll have breakfast and he'll have dinner at home. Lunch, it has to be packaged because you know what? He knows it's consistent. He knows it's going to taste the same every time. An apple could be mushy or hard. Like, you know what I mean? You actually can't guarantee it'll be the same. And I've had this, like, I felt like I needed to email his teacher and give her a whole like thing on, just so you know, Gray's only going to get packaged food for lunch. And I'm like, why do I feel the need to justify myself to someone when I'm doing what's best for my child? But we have such a culture of, we're very judgmental of like how other people parent. And I definitely, so this is another thing. Growing up in a home or in a faith community, I realized I expected people to mirror back to me that I was a good person. So it was like, oh, try, like, you're such a good little girl versus, and so much of my value came in what other people said versus like an inherent self-worth. And I definitely worry how people are going to judge my parenting. Looks incredibly ratchet to the world. Also, like, can I just be honest? Like, I'm sending a little brown boy into like a very white community who only eats Snickers, Lay's, and Cheetos. You know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about that because I know that like moving to Guelph where you live now, like that was a big thing for you from Toronto, right? It's like
Yeah.
now not only is he the boy that's getting Snickers and whatever in his lunch, but you're also worried about like the race dynamic and like how do you have that conversation, or do you, or I know you do, but like how does that look like when you talk to him about that?
Oh my goodness. It's so complicated. Like we've been having the race conversation since they were little, right? And like I said earlier, my daughter can pass as white. And so one is lighter, one is darker. And I think I told you, like at 4, he had asked the question, like, do you think people love Kaya more because she's lighter? Right. And so we've definitely, like, it's not just, he's not just a brown boy, he's a mixed brown boy. And so this hyphenated identity, I can't even fully understand for him. And I think he's had to find agency over it, right? Like I remember a few years ago in kindergarten, they were talking about skin tones. And so he was one of the only children of color in his class. And so his teacher had pointed that out to like celebrate his like beautiful brown skin. And he was like, no, excuse me, I am not brown. I am caramel macchiato. I'm like, you sound like the bougie.
God, I love this one.
Like, you are so bougie, but you've had to figure out what your mixed identity is. We have had the conversation. So, okay, in the height of like his dysregulation pre-burnout, like it was really violent. There were times when we needed to call for intervention, or were really close to calling for intervention. And the fear of having to call person in authority, it's like calling the police, right? And I'm calling authority on a little brown boy. Like it doesn't feel good in my body. It doesn't feel safe to him. And I think I carry a lot of fear of him being dysregulated in public and how the world will view him. Mark and I talk about it a lot. Like we've talked to the kids about it. I really don't want to put additional fear on them, but just also here's like the realities of life in child appropriate language. But yeah, I think I carry a lot more fear about it than Mark does. For example, right now, anything fitted is uncomfortable on Grayson's body. So it's very sensory friendly clothing. It's very baggy shorts. He wears my Nike slides because they're 2 sizes too big and it just feels comfortable.
Yeah.
But to me, I'm like, I'm sending a little brown boy into the world who is dressed in the most ridiculous way. I know the judgments that get made, right? So I don't know. I'm not answering your question. I think it's just something I just definitely wrestle with. And it's just always there. I don't have like a proper succinct answer of how I deal with it.
I think your answer is like the exact answer that makes sense. Like I feel like because there is not one right way. There's having the conversation, which you have with him, and talking about it with Mark and like trying to figure it out, but also not letting that hold you back. Like you're not saying, well, no, you have to wear fitted clothes because of this reason. But I think it's really it's a really important piece of the conversation that I think isn't talked about enough. And like, that's not a perspective I can really bring. So I'm so thankful for you for sharing that. I mean, I love Gray. I love the caramel macchiato comment. Like,
That's pretty clever.
You're bougie child.
You're right. It's his clever, like, I am white and I am brown, and this right now makes sense to me. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. And I think something that I've observed that you're just so good at with your kids is just having those conversations openly. Like you're not waiting for them to figure out that they're the one child who's brown in the school. Like you're having that conversation with them ahead of time, and also allowing them to feel really confident in that fact too, because you have that conversation and you're not trying to like hide that or make them ashamed of that part of themselves, which I think is good.
And now, the part of the show that you usually skip. But wait, don't touch that dial just yet, because today's sponsor might just change your life, or at least your bathroom habits. Let's talk about the potty toolkit from, yep, you guessed it, Nurtured First. Picture this. You're a parent staring into your toddler's eyes as they proudly poop in the corner. You've tried everything, letting them run around naked, promising them a toy pony if they use the potty, and even contemplating moving to a deserted island where diapers grow on trees. But nothing seems to work. Enter the Potty Toolkit by Nurtured First. This magical bundle of joy is designed to make potty training fun, easy, and, dare I say it, enjoyable for both you and your child. It's like having a team of potty training fairies at your beck and call, without the glitter and the creepy wings. The Potty Toolkit is packed with over 40 pages of stories, activities, games, and worksheets that will get your child excited to use the potty. And the best part? It's all backed by decades of research and designed by a team of child therapists who know their stuff. So if you're ready to ditch the diapers, head over to the link in the show notes and grab Potty Toolkit for 10% off. That's right, for less than the cost of a month's supply of diapers, you can have a fun-filled potty training experience. Don't wait, go to the link in the show notes now and get the Potty Toolkit by Nurtured First for 10% off today using the code ROBOTUNICORN. Your child and your bathroom floor will thank you.
when you grew up, and I know you grew up in Toronto, so maybe it was a little different. Like, did your parents have those kind of conversations with little Try, or is that something that you are kind of learning yourself how to have with your kids, like for the first time?
I think I'm learning how to have them. I don't think they intentionally didn't have them. So I think with the immigrant experience, and this is not like 100% our story, but first gen, so immigrant generation, there's a lot of assimilation. Second generation, there's a lot of like, I am not Indian at all. I'm not owning any of this culture. And then the next generation, so my children are very like, I will own this culture. This is me. I'm swinging back and I want to learn what was like taken away from me.
Would you say that that's accurate for yourself, that you've kind of not rejected, but like you don't take on too many of the Indian traditions or cultural norms or any of that?
I think 100%. So I grew up in a space where it's like, okay, so if you're cooking curry, every window's open, incense is burning, every candle is burning because you don't want to smell like curry. You don't want to smell like the Indian person. Right. And I get it. Like curry smells amazing, not always on your clothes. But even like growing up, it was like, okay, so how can I fit into the spaces that I am in, which were quite white, even though I was in like Scarborough and Rexdale, like very multicultural parts of Toronto, it's still a colonized identity of like, even if you're brown in Toronto, there's a lot of whiteness in that.
Mhm.
It's very pervasive. But it's been so interesting having the kids because as I've really desired to impart like a healthy like Indian heritage in them and French Canadian heritage in them, I've had to then embrace Indian customs and cultures that I haven't done in the past, whether it's like acknowledging the language more or the kids like are obsessed with Bollywood. Kaya took biryani for lunch today. Like they have the ability to be free about their culture and not hide things that I didn't because I was like, oh, I'm not going to be the one taking Indian food to school because it's going to make me look weird. Versus they're able to own their identity a lot more than I was.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I feel like, yeah, maybe you went through this time in your life where it's like, and I feel like a lot of kids are like that with their parents. Like, I don't want to be like them. I'm different. I'm not going to go to school smelling like curry. Like I don't want to be the Indian kid at school. And now you see your own kids and like, that's the reparenting piece too, where it's like, well, I don't want you to go to school and be ashamed of who you are, your culture. And then there's this piece of like, you have to kind of heal also that version of yourself to say, well, what am I interested in? Like, is there pieces of my culture like that I do want to take away or learn more about? And that is a healing, but also a difficult journey as well that I know like you've been on. And I think many immigrant families go through that too.
Absolutely. There's like your own like intentional and unintentional like decolonizing process. And then there's grief of what you feel like you missed out on. And I remember like growing up, whether it was articulated or not, the white way was the right way, right? It's like, oh, well, you know, we do things in like a silly, you know what? So I don't know if that's completely true, but it was just, I remember very much feeling like I wanted to be white because that would solve all of the problems. I would not be like the outsider. I wouldn't be different. And I think even though I had a very diverse group of friends, we had a very white identity. And so it was like, it was a lot of grief and healing and like just actually forgiving myself in the process. And actually, in some ways, moving to Guelph was one of the best gifts. Like it was hard. We've talked a lot about this, Jess, after like George Floyd was murdered. Sorry, I'm like having all the conversations on your podcast.
It's good.
It was hard being in a predominantly white space where it felt like people were waking up to racism. But it was also like such a good awakening to me of like, I can't hide my cultural identity anymore. Like, obviously I go into a room and you know I'm brown, but it was a call to embracing who I am for myself. I'm just realizing that Mark jokes about this all the time. He's like, I feel like I've been married to 5 different people. And the reality of like, we're constantly evolving and growing. And so I'm not the same woman I was when we started dating. And there are going to be different parts of myself that I'm going to embrace.
And thank goodness for that, right? Like, I always say that to Scott, like we started dating, we were so young.
Yeah, we did.
If I think to myself, like, yeah, I've changed, like, I'm glad. I am happy that I've changed and evolved and learned. And I think same for you, Scott. I mean,
I feel like we both have definitely changed quite a bit and several times.
And I think a big theme of our conversation today, too, is being a parent and how much that does or can make you reflect and change and want to do things different. I know for me, there's so many things that I reflected on after having our oldest that I would never have really thought about before. And those things have changed me and the way that we discipline. And Scott, I mean, for you, huge. So I'm just so glad, Try, that we could have this conversation today.
It was so good.
Let's head over to coffee time where Scott and I share some of our reflections from this amazing conversation.
All right, that was a pretty long discussion. That was super interesting, though. I found the discussion with Tryphena to be incredibly interesting. Again, she thinks about things very deeply. So we covered a lot in that episode. There's some things that you and I, we really can't relate to in her journey as a parent. So with that being said, like, what do you hope people are going to take away from this discussion with Tryphena?
I know you're going to laugh at this as the response because this is just the most classic Jess thing to say, but curiosity is a theme.
Of course.
Always. Always. Getting curious, always. But curiosity was a theme when I was re-listening to the episode right before we recorded this. I just noticed in everything that we talked about, from her son's challenges that she's been having, the reparenting stuff we talked about, the inner child work. There's this curiosity in Tryphena about her own life experiences, the things that she's been through, and also in the way that she approaches her kids and her friendships that I think really makes her stand out. And that's why we can have these deeper discussions, because she's just curious. And I think if we can take that same curiosity approach to our own children and to ourselves, like, I wonder why I'm getting so triggered in this situation, or I wonder why I'm viewing this child in this specific way. Or why do I hold this belief? Like, where did this belief come from? Just because I was taught it by my parents, does that make it true to me? I think having that curiosity about life just helps us be people who can be reflective and critical thinkers and the parents that we want to be. So for me, that was the takeaway that I had from the episode and something that's really stuck with me.
I can see that. Now, just to be a skeptic here for a second.
Love it.
Being a parent is incredibly busy. There's hundreds of things you have to do or think of in a day. And so you saying that honestly sounds a little bit tiring to me. Like, I'm already tired. So then to add deep introspection to my life and to think so deeply when I feel like I'm not getting enough sleep, I'm not able to do enough at work, I feel like I'm forgetting all the things that I have to give my kids to bring to school with them. So how can someone realistically, when they're so busy and tired, like, I guess, first of all, does it ever get better? And second, okay, if it's like this and it's this busy, how can I add that into my life without me feeling even more tired?
I think that's a really good question. And you're asking, how do I fit curiosity into my life? Well, I'm thinking about a story of myself this morning.
Yep.
So I hurt my foot. That's a whole other story for another podcast. If you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen this whole thing. Long story short, I do this whole post. I'm trying to add fun and playfulness back into my life. Next post. I was doing a dance workout and I fell on my ankle and now it really hurts. So anyway, it's been this big thing that my ankle's been very, very sore.
Might be broken.
We're not sure.
Still waiting on results.
And I haven't been sleeping well because of it. So last night I ended up sleeping in the guest bed, propped my foot up all night long. I couldn't really sleep. So I woke up this morning and I was so tired. We didn't have coffee in the house. And then the kids are totally melting down. And I have a choice. Like, do I just enter into this chaos with them and be like, you guys are bad. You're not listening to me. I'm so tired. I can't handle this. That is work, right? That's work that I would have to do to get frustrated and angry at them for having meltdowns. And that would take time and effort to do. Curiosity is also work, but either way, we're doing work. So I just took a moment and I literally have one kid sitting on my hurt foot. I have another kid pulling on my other leg. And I have my oldest crying, holding her raccoon in the corner because she's so overwhelmed by her sisters. So everybody's melting down. And in that moment, I decide I'm going to be curious about what's going on. And so I get on the level of the two little girls and I give them hugs and I say, what's happening? And they say, I don't want you to go back to work and I'm going to miss you today. And that moment of pause and curiosity helps me understand they're worried about separation and I'm going to go to work again today and that's really tricky for them. And then I can help them with that. If I didn't get curious, I'd also still have to deal with the emotions. Maybe I'm sending them to time out, the naughty chair. It's still work. So either way, you're doing work. So I guess to answer your question, yes, curiosity feels like more work to a parent, but also we're doing work either way. So I guess it's how do you want to spend your time?
I kind of see the reacting to a situation. It's for your brain, the path of least resistance, though,
yes.
Right? It's like the automatic response to a situation that your body thinks is basically something is attacking you or something is not necessarily unsafe, but yeah, it's your brain's automatic response. So it's the path of least resistance for your brain to do that. So being curious is more of like you have to be intentional about it. And so that goes back to my question again about how do you actually bring that into your life? How can you build that as a habit of getting curious constantly so that it becomes less work even when you are tired?
This is actually a conversation Tryphena and I had, and I will always remember it. It was like probably 3 years ago. We were talking about how when our kids yell at us, it was super triggering. And I was telling her how our body can't really differentiate, like yet at that point until we train it, between a true attack on us and our kids yelling at us, right? Our fight or flight response is activated in the same way. So your body is basically thinking, I have to respond as if I'm getting attacked by someone or something, especially if you grew up in trauma and when someone yelled at you, it actually was like an attack and you actually had to protect yourself and preserve yourself. So that's why your first instinct is going to be, how can I protect myself in that situation when your kids are yelling, and you're going to yell back, or you're going to get really angry, or you're going to run away and shut your kids out, because that is what your body wants to do to preserve you. And so to work against that instinct is really hard because it is programmed and it's deeply conditioned in us. What I would say to parents is practicing when you're calm is the number one thing that you can do. So trying to be curious for the first time in a moment when your toddler is screaming, I hate you at you, is going to be very difficult. But if you can practice being curious in a moment when your kids are sleeping and you're just going to journal about one thing that happened that day, one meltdown that happened and how you felt about it and why it was so difficult for you and why you think it might have been hard for your kid. Those tiny moments where you can be intentional about reflecting on what happened is what will help you eventually be able to reflect in the moment, like what I was just talking about.
Yeah. Okay. I think that makes sense. That's probably going to be easier said than done for a lot of parents, especially with, I would say for us, like younger kids.
Yeah.
Because you can see as our kids are getting older, it'll be easier for us to have that moment, have that time to do it. But when you're even the first year postpartum, maybe even longer, I mean, let's be real, you were exhausted.
Oh, and I know I yelled at the kids more in that season of life because I also I wasn't sleeping well. I had the hormones going on. There were so many people who needed me.
Yep.
I was also sad and struggling with my own emotions. So it was really hard to be like, oh, let's be curious. It was hard. And now it's easy for me. I feel like now it's like my first response.
Yeah, right.
What about for you? Do you still find it pretty difficult, or do you find that that's your first response now?
It depends on the situation. So I would say in general, if I'm well rested, yeah, no problem. But I need my sleep.
Yeah.
Like that's known to all of us
Scott
in the
needs his
family.
sleep.
Even the kids know. Sometimes I am a little bit more grumpy because I did not get enough sleep.
Yeah.
So I try to be actively getting my rest that I need when I'm well rested, which I would say is getting better over time. As the kids are getting older, I'm getting more rest. Then, yeah, it's not a problem for me that's my first response. But like even this weekend, I didn't sleep that well the one night and you were gone because you were at the hospital for your ankle.
Yeah.
I was more grumpy than normal. So that's how I responded to them during that day. Not all the entire time, but it was just more often I was not as curious about things and more just grumpy.
So what you just did there is incredibly important, because what you just did is reflected on why you had a grumpy day. And you were able to actually reflect on, I was grumpy on Sunday, but it actually had nothing to do with the kids. The kids were just being kids. It had everything to do with...
Yeah, they were no different than normal.
Yeah, they were no different than normal, but you were different than normal because I was gone, so you're home alone with the
and it was the time change. That probably was a big...
The time change.
That had a big part to play.
The dang time change is really impacting us with these kids.
Yep.
The time change, the kids were grumpier because they lost sleep. You didn't sleep well the night before. Like there was just a bunch of factors that made you grumpy. But the fact that you can now pause, reflect on what happened that day, and see that actually had everything to do with you not having the tools within yourself to act the way that you want to as a parent, that is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. For sure. This episode was very interesting. I enjoyed listening to the conversation between you and Tryphena. I think other people will as well.
Yeah, I hope everybody gets as much out of this episode as we did. Hey friends, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We are glad that you are here. If you enjoyed today's episode and found it interesting, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a rating and a review. Scott and I actually sit down together and read them all. A 5-star rating helps us share our podcast and get these important messages out there. Thank you so much for listening, and we can't wait to talk to you again next time.